We now have our last speaker. Mark Kenber is the CEO of the Climate Group. The Climate Group is a not-for-profit organization that aims at bringing businesses and subnational entities on the way of acting against climate change.
Great. Thank you very much. So I think what I'm going to say is going to complement and perhaps sadly duplicate some of what you've heard already. Leadership is normally required at times of crisis, of times of great change, of disruption, and so on and so forth. Largely, I would argue, because most people resist change. And I used to have a presentation that I gave that had some wonderful slides about showing people, for example, the boss of IBM talking to the then founder, Steve Jobs of Apple, saying, no one's going to want those silly little things on their desks called computers. The guy, Lord Kelvin, saying that things that are heavier than air cannot fly. You know, this was a Nobel Prize winner, founder of the Royal Society. Lots of people resist change. Lots of people don't believe in change, partly because, or I would say largely because they don't want to believe in change. It's quite scary. And I mean, if you just ask yourselves about all the things that are obvious good sense. I asked the professor here about switching LED lights in her house, not to put her on the spot or anything. And I have to admit, I haven't changed all the lights in my house. But as we heard from Norman earlier, energy efficiency investments have huge beneficial returns. With LED lighting, you can reduce your electricity bill for the lighting part by 80%. Return on your investment, sometimes less than 12 months. And yet we don't do it. Why not? It might not work, or I don't know, my wife might not like it, or it doesn't look so good, or always find lots of reasons to resist change. And at those times where change is needed is when we most need leadership. And clearly, as we heard this morning, we're not going to get to a net zero carbon economy, a sub 2 degree or a close to 1.5 degree economy through incremental, imperceptible shifts. It's going to be transformational change. And very rarely do we see transformational change happen in the absence of leadership. Now, the next point is, what is this leadership? And I'm a little bit wary of standing up in one of the world's leading business schools talking about business leadership when I've never led a business in my life. But I'm going to have a go, and I'm going to use some quotes that I dug off the internet, so if I'm wrong, blame them. One is from a guy who everyone quotes, Sun Tzu, who said that leaders create moral law and strictly adhere to the proper methods for applying them. And then a former professor from here actually said, leaders are people who do the right thing, managers are people who do things right. And I quite like that as well. So there's something about rightness and setting moral direction. And then Eisenhower, who said, which I rather like because it's kind of what I try and do as a CEO, I do not very much work and get rid of everybody else to do it, is leadership is the art of getting someone to do something you want to do by making them want to do it themselves. So there are some elements there which I think are relevant to this question of climate change. One is about having a vision, and we've heard about this from both the previous speakers. You've got to have a vision. It's got to be something that's believable, something that's exciting, something that's achievable, but it's also going to be something that's new. And that new is going to have to be aligned with what we've heard this morning, net zero emissions in 50 years' time. And let's just bear in mind for a moment, this is something that Bjorn's just alluded to. This idea of net zero emissions in the world in 50 years' time is not something that I step back and say, well, that's what you're going to do. It's not much scope for any of us to have a lot of emissions if everyone else is going to have, if the world's going to have net zero emissions. So it's, you know, Mike in his company and Bjorn in his company won't be able to say, we're just going to carry on as we were because everyone else is going to have net zero. If you're down to zero, if someone has a bit more, then someone's going to have some negative emissions, and that's going to be quite difficult. So we're all going to have that vision of some point in probably around 50 years' time where you're going to have net zero emissions, and you're going to need to have some pretty brave, and as I think the words that Bjorn used, some courageous leadership based on optimism to achieve that. So it's going to mean breaking with the conventional wisdom, and the conventional wisdom is often going to be the people who are closest to you. One example of that is I run an NGO that works on climate change, and as you were told, works with businesses and subnational governments to try and drive climate action and climate leadership. And one of the things that we talk about a lot is collaboration. The only way we will have progress is by getting businesses and governments to collaborate. 2 years before the Paris climate negotiations, I was sitting with the same Christiana Figueres that Mike was talking about, and she said to me, so there you are standing up, you're talking about innovation, NGOs, probably the least innovative sector in the economy, and you're talking about collaboration, and I can count 7 NGOs in this conference today who are competing with each other to see who's Mike's best friend or Bjorn's best friend or, as it was at the time, Paul Pullman's best friend, who's going to get the front page of the FT. We're all competing for the same funding pots. We have 7 CEOs who all, including myself, who want to be the one who's the best. And you're telling everyone else to collaborate. You don't even talk to each other. And so I kind of looked at my ground shiftily because she's quite hard to argue with. And I said, yes, you're right. And so she'd said this to the other 6 people as well. So we'd all had the same lecture. And she said to us, if you want to get an outcome in Paris, then there is one sector that is going to have to really drive change, and that's going to be the business community. And they're not going to do it if they can play you off against each other. And they're not going to do it unless they've got a clear vision. So we came together and we formed a coalition called We Mean Business, which is now a dozen or so organizations. And we've been going for 2.5 years. And the first year, as like any collaboration, was a little bit of, well, I'll tell them the things I don't really want myself, or I'll tell them the funders who I know are not going to fund them. I'm certainly not going to tell them any about the ones who I'm going to fund me. And I'll give them the interview with the Brighton Argus, but not with the FT, or whatever it may be. And then slowly we realized that actually there were some benefits because people like Mike and others said, it's a hell of a lot easier if we only get one message and you're all telling us the same thing, and we're not having to kind of say, oh, well, you want us to do this, and you want us to do something the same, but it's actually presented slightly differently. So we've come together, and one of the things that we've tried to work on is taking these somewhat abstract concepts of leadership and the net zero emissions and turn them into a series of practical things that businesses can do. And so if you think that the bit about leadership is creating that vision, it's also 2 other things. It's getting other people on board behind it, and this is what previous speakers have spoken about, but also turning into something that's practical. It's all very well having a vision of something, and I'm not going to say anything untoward, but being beyond something if you can't actually find the practical ways of getting there. So if you're going to be beyond carbon, then you've got to have some practical steps. So we've come up with a set of platforms, which I'll just sort of throw out there because I think they're quite interesting, and also some of the companies in the room have already part of them. A starting point is, as you've just heard, 2/3 of greenhouse gas emissions in the world come from energy. And the recently formed Energy Transition Commission has kind of framed this quite neatly in what you need to do. It's been said already, you've got to decarbonize the energy you use, and to make it a lot cheaper and easier, you've got to use a lot less energy. So you increase your clean energy and you improve your energy productivity. To keep within a 2-degree world, we need to pretty much double the background improvement of energy productivity. The world improves its energy productivity, that's output per unit energy, by about 1% a year. To give us a reasonable chance of 2 degrees, we need to double that to 2% a year. We also know that we need to decarbonize the electricity sector pretty quickly, and we need to probably double at least, if not triple, the uptake or the adoption of clean energy around the world. So taking that as a starting point, we've said to companies, well, if you want to be leaders, then what are you going to do, what can you do across these 2 sectors, these 2 areas of work that will be A, show genuine leadership, B, be practical, and C, should be able to generate you a reasonable rate of return. So the first one we set up was across the board, set a science-based target. And this is something some of our colleagues from Carbon Disclosure Project, World Resources Institute are doing. So if you're going to get to net zero, that's based on the science of climate change. It's not a number plucked out of the air. So a company needs to have a trajectory which will get it to net zero carbon. It may mean you saying to yourself, I'm not an oil company, or I'm not a steel company, but I'm an energy company, because people really don't want to buy oil, they want to have energy. Or I'm not a car company, I'm a mobility company, because in 50 years' time, people are still going to want to get around. They may not want to buy cars. Or I'm not a steel company, what I'm going to have is building materials. We're still going to need to make things. So you may have to have a different vision, but it's got to be consistent with a science-based target, which is effectively net zero emissions. So that's fine. Now you need to get more practical. So coming to that energy piece, we set up 2 platforms. One which is, and Marks and Spencer's are one of the members of this, is RE100. commit to being 100% renewable powered. When we launched this campaign on the 20th of September 2014, the day before the Ban Ki-moon's climate summit, about 10 weeks before, we had 2 companies signed up who were a little bit scared that they were going to be the only 2 companies. And about 10 days before, we had 2 companies signed up. And 10 hours before, literally 10 hours before, we had 2 companies signed up, and they were getting really, really jittery, including one of them who was the Chief Sustainability Officer, was my predecessor as the CEO of the Climate Group, who was ringing me up at 4 o'clock in the morning going, what is going on? Fortunately, 10 minutes before, we had 14 companies signed up, and everyone was happy. Now there are about 75 of them. And the most interesting thing about them, and I'm sure Mike and others here will tell you, is that you can make a business case for being 100% renewable powered. It's not just something that's nice. It's much better to go 100% than 80%, as Steve Howard and others will say, because if you're saying to your employees, we're going to go 77% renewable, they say, well, what's wrong with the other 23%? If you're going 100%, that's leadership, that's exciting. And there are a number of reasons why it works. Some of it because if you're signing on a long-term PPA, at a fixed price, you don't have to pay money for hedging against electricity price volatility. It's probably going to be cheaper in the long run anyway. Your customers will like it. The competitors will get envious, which is always a good thing. And we know that, for example, that when Unilever came out with their 100% renewable power commitment under RE100, Procter & Gamble, who had an exceptionally ambitious 40% target, got bashed a bit by their shareholders and some of their internal stakeholders and have now signed up as well. So that's the first commitment. It's a lot easier than people think. Now, it's probably not quite so easy if you're Statoil with large industrial facilities. But interesting, we have 2 car companies that have signed up, and we expect later this year the world's largest emitting car manufacturer also to sign up. So it's not just retailers and financial institutions. People will see that this makes sense. And as you have to get the money from your CFO to invest in some of these renewable power plants, you've got to make the business case for it. As you heard from Norman this morning, and you've heard from others, it's a lot easier to go renewable powered if you use a lot of energy, less energy in the first place. So the second campaign is EP 100, Energy Productivity 100, which is launched in 2 weeks' time. So this is a sneak preview with the Global Alliance for Energy Productivity, where companies, and as a number of governments have done, will commit to doubling their energy productivity by 2030. Now, that's a lot harder, actually, than committing to 100% renewable power. If you think background, average energy efficiency improvements is about 1% a year. This is asking you to do about 4% a year. It's a tough call, but the really exciting thing is that it's not the usual suspects who are the first to sign up. The first company to commit to this is Mahindra & Mahindra from India. Well, there's a good logical reason why they might do that. Indian energy productivity is about half the world average, so there's a lot to make up. And they did some first back-of-the-envelope numbers for their CFO, and who realized, we're going to save a lot of money out of here. We're going to be a lot smarter and a lot more productive than our competitors. So there, the interesting thing about the leader, the person who the CEO who liked the idea, realized that he had to get people to buy in. So he got an internal team to run the numbers for each manufacturing division to show how they were going to save money, how they would make more money, and then he attached their bonuses to it. So let's hope they make it, because then some engineers across India will be making some nice bonuses in the next 2 or 3 years. And I can go through a long list, but there are a lot of these leadership commitments which companies take 2 approaches to. One is, no idea how we'll get there, but we're going to sign on the dotted line and we'll work it out. And then there are the others who work it out and work it out and work it out and finally say, well, let's just do it anyway. Because no one knows what their companies are going to look like in 50 years' time. But what they are also doing is looking at things like electrification of their vehicle fleets. And later this year, the We Mean Business Coalition will launch another campaign, which is undoubtedly going to be called EV 100, because they all have 100s in them, where we're talking to a number of companies about committing to 100% electrified fleets across their light goods vehicles and across their corporate fleets. And Mike's already mentioned another of the campaigns, which is removing tropical deforestation from the supply chain. And you can go on. And that's all about walking the talk, and that's important, and that's leadership. But there's also talking the walk. And people often say you've got to walk the talk because it's all very easy to stand up in public and shout a lot. It is, but it's not easy to do it if you do it with all this stuff going on behind you, and you need to do it practically because we won't get there without government. Over the last few years, probably the biggest shift in the climate debate has been the shift from government leadership, or at least national government leadership, to business leadership. And if you think why we were successful in Paris, one of the reasons was the business community for the first time said, we want this. And not in the sense we want a global price on carbon and then we'll do something knowing damn well they're not going to get one. But actually we want this, 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 and this, and they expressed it in legal terms. And they said it's going to be a major risk to us if you don't take action. And then they said, and by the way, here are all the things we're doing that make business sense. So this isn't us just trying to look good. These are investments we've made. And by not investing in policy, you are going to undermine the investments we've made. So walking the talk and talking the walk are equally important. And so other things that companies who are leading are doing are actually investing in responsible policy engagement, not doing something, signing up to a renewables commitment on the one hand and then spending an awful lot on corporate lobbyists trying to undermine renewables policy, but actually actively pushing for that renewables policy because somehow they've twigged that actually the two things are consistent. It makes life easier for themselves. So leadership is not always about beating yourself up. It's about looking at different ways of achieving it. So it's building the constituency from policy, from your internal stakeholders, to make your own commitments more achievable, but also to drag others along. And I think every individual company, every city, every state will say, they'll look at the Bjorn circles and say, well, we're only this tiny little circle, and leadership is about making the rest of the circle come along with you. So I think we can see at this time, leadership is absolutely essential. But it doesn't have to be painful. It's about managing change, but it's recognizing that there's a vision, which is a vision of a net zero carbon economy, a net zero carbon company, but one that's going to be making healthy profits in the long term. Thank you.